Many of us are familiar with the jazz culture of the Roaring Twenties, which epitomized European society after the First World War, though few today have heard of Ada Bricktop Smith, a jazz club owner and socialite who became something of a cultural legend. Join me as we explore her story. The woman who would become famous as Bricktop was born as Ada Beatrice Smith in the town of Alderson in West Virginia on the 14th of August 1894. Somewhat eccentrically, she adopted several further middle names during her lifetime, including Queen Victoria, derived from the long-reigning monarch of Britain, and Virginia, after the region of America she came from. Her parents both had backgrounds as enslaved people in the American South. For instance, her mother was born in the midst of the American Civil War in the early 1860s and was theoretically enslaved for the first 2 years of her life before Union victory in the war and the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation ended slavery in the United States. Her parents also had mixed race backgrounds, and Ada was partly Irish on her mother's side. When she was young, Ada's father died, and the family headed north from West Virginia to Chicago in the early stages of the Great Migration. This migration lasted for decades, from about 1910 to the 1960s, and saw millions of African Americans migrate from the southern states to the growing industrial cities of the north like Chicago, Detroit, and Cleveland. Ada began working in saloons and bars in Chicago from a young age. It wasn't long before she was also appearing in stage productions in theatres. Her first appearance was in a staging of Uncle Tom's Cabin in the Haymarket Theatre in Chicago. It was also during this period that she acquired the name Bricktop, seemingly in reference to her reddish hair, a byproduct of her Irish heritage. When she was just 16, Smith left home to tour the Midwest with a stage troupe, performing a vaudeville act with other African Americans. When this work ended, she drifted towards New York. There she was employed for a time in Barron's nightclub in Harlem, a part of New York which was transitioning around this time from being a white neighborhood dominated by old New York families of Dutch descent to become the center of a thriving African American cultural renaissance. She spent some of the 1910s and early 1920s here, though she also toured the country, returning for a time to Chicago and traveling out west to California. It was during these years that her skills as a jazz singer, vaudeville performer, and all-round dancer were honed. Despite her moderate success in America, in the early 1920s, Smith decided to leave the United States for Europe. In a recent biography of Bricktop, written in the first person, as though from her perspective, and using her correspondence and own writings as source material, her decision to relocate from Harlem in New York to Paris in France is explained in the following terms. I had intercepted a wire Jean Bullard sent to Coney's Inn in Harlem asking for a girl to come over to Paris to sing at Le Grand Duc. I had been looking to shape things up in my life. Jobs were getting harder to come by for us singers and dancers, no matter how high-toned we were. We were all competing for a few spots. The jazzmen travelling back and forth across the Atlantic said the living was easier in Paris. Best of all, it was free of race prejudice. I dreamed about eating, drinking and socializing, wherever and with whomever I choose. Thus, Smith set off for France either in late 1923 or early 1924. Smith had moved to a city which was the cultural capital of the world. Paris had emerged in this role in the second half of the 19th century, when writers like Émile Zola, Alexandre Dumas, and Marcel Proust lived here along with poets and painters such as Baudelaire and Monet. These people frequented clubs like the Moulin Rouge and established Paris's reputation as the world centre of dance culture and debauchery. In the aftermath of the First World War and the crises that followed it, such as the Spanish flu pandemic and the civil wars and revolutions which gripped countries like Germany, Turkey and Russia, a new generation of writers, poets, painters and dancers flocked to Paris. These included people like the writers James Joyce and Ernest Hemingway, and the poet Pond. The scene was propped up by an enormous economic boom and financial speculation from 1923 onwards, one which would catastrophically burst in 1929, but which saw a lot of money flowing around Paris prior to that. In this environment, there was peak demand for jazz singers, dancers, and others associated with Paris's vibrant nightlife. Bricktop quickly emerged onto the Paris scene, becoming a close acquaintance of the writer F. Scott Fitzgerald as he spent time in the French capital, Hemingway, and others. Where these writers and artists came, more people followed, and soon people were showing up to Ada's shows once figures like Fitzgerald and Hemingway began frequenting them. Her prominence continued to rise, and she was often hired by Cole Porter as an entertainer at his parties. Here she was known to teach guests the latest dance craze, such as the Charleston and the Black Bottom, and it is even said that she instructed the future King Edward VIII how to do both. She was already considering branching out and setting up her own place, annoyed by how small the Parisian dance clubs were, by comparison with the venues back in the US. However, her first effort ran into licensing problems, and never got off the ground. In 1926, Smith finally managed to open her own place. She called it Chez Bricktop, and it was an instant success, becoming an important cultural spot in Paris in the second half of the Roaring Twenties. It produced many legendary tales. On one occasion, the great American writer John Steinbeck, author of The Grapes of Wrath and Of Mice and Men, was drunkenly thrown out of Chez Bricktop by Smith. Steinbeck famously apologised by having a taxi full of roses sent across Paris to the club. Afterwards, he was welcomed back by Ada. The famed Fred Astaire even visited and performed at the club. The club is also referenced in numerous published works of the time by Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Evelyn Waugh and others. It was short-lived success though. In the autumn of 1929, the Wall Street crash occurred, followed by the Great Depression. As this all commenced, the booze-soaked jazz scene and parties of the 1920s became a distant memory, and clubs like Chez Bricktop struggled. Many had to eventually close their doors. Chez Bricktop was popular enough that it continued for a while, but eventually the lights went out. Smith returned to the US for a time, where she found sporadic work. The precarious nature of this, combined with the death of her mother in 1938, left her suffering from severe anxiety, while the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939 further dented the entertainment industry at a time when it had only just begun to recover properly from the effects of the Great Depression. Yet, she had made her mark on Europe in the 1920s and would soon return there. While the 1930s and early 1940s were difficult times for Bricktop, she soon got back on her feet. In 1942, she had relocated to Mexico, one of the few parts of the world which was relatively unaffected by the war. There she set up a successful club in Mexico City and managed it for several years. Then, as Europe rebuilt and the economy recovered after the destruction of the Second World War, she headed back to Paris in 1949. Sadly, the city was no longer as she remembered it. The French capital lost its place as the cultural capital of the world in the 1930s, and it never really got it back, the title shifting to New York City, a place where Ada was well aware that vaudeville and dancing were not in high demand. Accordingly, she headed to Rome instead after a brief attempt at newfound success in Paris. In the Italian capital, she had something of an Indian summer, running a successful club here through the 1950s. She entertained many famous guests here, including Elizabeth Taylor, Frank Sinatra, Martin Luther King Jr., and more. She even had a close friendship with the abdicated King of Egypt, King Farouk I, for many years, with Farouk bringing Bricktop gifts from his travels like bottles of perfume and cigars. One element of Smith's life which has been widely commentated on in recent years is her sexuality. In 1927 in Paris, she met and began a relationship with a saxophone player by the name of Peter du Conge. They married in 1929, though the marriage soon ran into trouble as Smith became aware of du Conge's affairs. They effectively split up in the 1930s, yet they were never officially divorced, and they remained legally married until du Conge died in 1967. However, it seems very likely that Smith was also bisexual. In the second half of the 1920s, one of the most noted performers at Chez Bricktop was the American-born jazz singer Josephine Baker, a woman notable for being the first African-American woman to star in a major motion picture when she appeared in Siren of the Tropics in 1927. Bricktop told one of Baker's children many years later that they had been in a sexual relationship back in the 1920s when Baker was a regular performer at Chez Bricktop. Bricktop closed her final club on the Via Veneto in Rome in 1961. She was 67 years old by then, and when interviewed about the closure stated, quote, "I'm tired, honey, tired of staying up till dawn every day." She returned to America, where she occasionally forayed out of retirement, opening clubs for brief periods of time in New York, although there were never sustained efforts. Instead, her final years were largely dedicated to charitable work, and she became a devout Roman Catholic. Smith died in her sleep at home in her apartment in Manhattan on the 1st of February 1984. She was 89 years of age and had lived a long and successful life. She was buried in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. Although she had been out of the public eye for many years and the jazz scene was long gone, her death was widely reported on in the New York Times and other prominent publications. Thank you so much everyone for watching this video on Ada Bricktop Smith. I hope you found it interesting. Let me know what you thought of her life down below in the comments, and if you have any other suggestions, also be sure to leave them down below in the comments. I hope you guys are subscribed and have notifications turned on to get all my videos as soon as I upload them. Anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.